On a freezing winter night, billionaire widow Evelyn Carter spotted a homeless father shielding his little daughter from the snow at a gas station. Something in his quiet dignity stopped her cold. Against everyone's warnings, she hired the stranger as her personal driver. But the man carried secrets deeper than poverty. He spoke like a man who once commanded boardrooms, not back alleys. He knew details about powerful people he should never have known. And when Evelyn accidentally uncovered his real identity, she realized the homeless dad she rescued wasn't broken at all. He was a man the entire city once feared, and someone had destroyed his life on purpose. The mansion on Ridgemont Hill had 14 rooms. Evelyn Carter used 3 of them. The rest stood empty, the way grief leaves rooms standing, but strips them of any reason to enter. She had lived like that for 3 years, moving through the same hallways, sitting at the same long dining table, set for one, signing the same documents that kept Carter Logistics alive, while she herself felt less and less like living. The bedroom she'd shared with Richard still held his reading lamp on the nightstand. She hadn't moved it. She wasn't sure whether that was loyalty or simply the paralysis that comes from knowing that some objects once disturbed will require an acknowledgement you are not ready to make. Her late husband, Richard Carter, had built the company from a single freight depot in Ohio into a coast-to-coast empire. He had been loud and warm and occasionally insufferable about his opinions on everything from red wine to infrastructure policy, and she had loved him completely, in the specific way you love someone who fills rooms with their presence and makes silence feel temporary. When he died in what the police called a tragic accident on a rainy highway outside the city, Evelyn had buried him, buried her questions, and buried most of herself along with him. The grief counselor she saw 4 times had said she was processing remarkably well. She had not gone back. She was 44 years old, wealthier than she could spend in 3 lifetimes, and entirely alone in a house that echoed. Her personal assistant, Margaret, worried about her constantly. The board of directors worried about her professionally. She gave them all the same answer: she was fine. She was always fine. She had learned that being fine was the only version of herself the world found useful, and she had become very good at performing it. It was the first Tuesday of December when her driver, a man named Gerald, who had worked for her for 6 years, called in to say he was quitting. His mother had taken ill in Portland. He needed to be there. Evelyn told him she understood, and she meant it, but when she set the phone down, she felt a small and irrational wave of loss that had nothing to do with Gerald and everything to do with being someone who was always being left. She told Margaret not to bother finding a replacement that night. She would drive herself to the quarterly partner dinner downtown. Margaret looked at her the way people look at children who insist on touching hot stoves, but said nothing. Evelyn took the car out at 7 in the evening into a sky that had been threatening snow all week and finally decided to deliver on its promise. The traffic seized up 2 miles from downtown, the kind of slow, stupid gridlock that forms for no visible reason on cold nights. Evelyn sat in the heated leather interior of her black sedan and watched the snow collect on the windshield between wiper passes. She was not impatient. She had stopped being impatient about small things years ago when she learned that life reserved its real cruelty for things you could not sit through. The GPS rerouted her off the main boulevard and onto a commercial strip she did not usually travel past, a 24-hour pharmacy and a closed laundromat and a gas station blazing white light into the dark. She slowed because a delivery truck had double-parked at the corner, and it was in that mandatory pause that she saw them. A man was crouched beside the gas station's exterior wall, out of the direct wind but not out of the cold. He was maybe 38, lean in a way that spoke of missing meals rather than discipline, wearing a jacket that was clearly not enough for this weather. The child beside him could not have been older than 7. She was tucked under his arm, her small face pressed against his chest, and he had unzipped his jacket and wrapped it around her so that she was cocooned inside it while he sat exposed to the wind. The girl said something, and he tilted his head down to listen, and even from inside a car with the windows up, there was something in the angle of his head, some quality of complete attention that Evelyn found she could not look away from. He laughed softly at whatever the child said, not a performance of cheerfulness, a real laugh, small and private. Then he turned, and Evelyn saw him notice a car nearby with its hood up, hazard lights blinking orange into the snow. He said something to the girl, settled her against the wall with his jacket, and walked to the car. The driver, an older woman in a good coat, was standing beside it, looking helpless. The man said something to her. She stepped aside, and within 4 minutes, with no tools that Evelyn could see beyond whatever was in his pockets, he had the car running. The older woman reached into her purse. He shook his head. She insisted. He shook his head again, more gently this time, smiled at her, and walked back to his daughter. The girl had watched the whole thing. When he returned and wrapped her back inside his jacket, she patted his cheek with one small hand and said clearly enough that Evelyn caught it through the glass, "Daddy, don't worry. I know you'll fix everything." Evelyn did not go to the partner dinner. She sat in the car for another minute after the traffic cleared, her hands on the wheel, not moving. Then she pulled into the gas station lot, got out into the cold, and walked toward a stranger with no plan beyond the thing that had been forming quietly in her chest since she watched him fix that car without asking for anything in return. She introduced herself simply, without titles. He stood and gave his name the same way, Daniel Brooks. His handshake was firm and unhurried. His eyes were steady and dark and held no self-pity at all. She asked if he needed work. She told him she needed a driver. She watched something move across his face, not gratitude exactly, and not pride exactly, something between the two that was its own difficult thing. He looked at his daughter. The girl looked back at him with absolute confidence. He said yes. The staff at Ridgemont Hill did not receive Daniel Brooks warmly. Margaret said nothing outright, but her silences carried full sentences. The household manager, a meticulous man named Franklin, found 3 separate reasons to appear in the kitchen the morning after Daniel and his daughter arrived, and was introduced each time with a new and pressing administrative question that had nothing to do with administration. The 2 groundskeepers exchanged a look. One of the younger housekeepers asked Margaret in a whisper. Evelyn was not supposed to hear whether a background check had been run. Margaret said one was being processed. This was true. What Margaret did not say, what she could not have known yet, was that the background check was going to come back producing results that made very little sense. The name Daniel Brooks returned almost nothing. There was a driver's license from 4 years ago, an address in Denver that had lapsed, a credit file that stopped abruptly and then restarted with the thin profile of someone who had been using cash for a long time. No criminal history, no civil judgments, nothing that should have belonged to a man who discussed freight market strategy with the easy fluency of someone who had spent a decade building things. It was, Evelyn would later think, the profile of someone who had not disappeared by accident, someone who had known exactly which threads to cut. Daniel's daughter was named Lily. She was 7 years old and had her father's dark eyes and a habit of observing rooms before she entered them fully, as if performing a quiet assessment of whether they were safe. The first morning, Evelyn found her standing in the doorway of the sunroom, looking at the wall of windows overlooking the snow-covered garden. Evelyn asked if she wanted to come in. Lily considered this for a moment, then walked in and stood beside her and looked at the garden too. "It's very big," Lily said. "It is," Evelyn agreed. "Do you have kids?" Lily asked. "No," Evelyn said. There was a pause. "That's okay," Lily said with the kind of easy acceptance that only children and very old people manage. "We can share." Evelyn did not know what to say to that. She said nothing, which seemed to be the right answer, because Lily nodded as if something had been agreed upon and asked if she could have orange juice. Daniel drove with the precision of someone who had been trained, not someone who had simply been doing it long enough. He anticipated traffic rather than reacting to it. He knew which routes through downtown cleared fastest after 6 in the evening and which parking structures had the exits that didn't feed into the worst intersections. On the 4th day, when Evelyn had a lunch meeting at the Whitmore Club, Daniel pulled to the correct entrance without being told the members-only side, and held the door with the practiced ease of someone who had walked through those doors himself at some point. Evelyn noticed. She said nothing. At the lunch itself, a board member named Gregory Halstead mentioned the projected freight market disruption from the Port of Los Angeles restructuring, and when Evelyn returned to the car, she referenced it casually, wanting to see how Daniel responded. He said without hesitation, That the Los Angeles port issue was largely a political performance, and that the real vulnerability in logistics over the next 18 months was going to be the rail corridor pricing agreements in the central states. He said it the way people say things they've spent years thinking about. Then he seemed to realize he'd said it and looked back at the road and said nothing else. Evelyn watched his profile for a moment. She said, "You've been in this industry." He said, "I've been in a lot of industries." She let it rest, but she did not forget it. The evening of the 9th day, a man named Victor Ashworth attended the Carter Logistics investor reception that Evelyn hosted at the house. Victor Ashworth was 60, silver-haired, and controlled a private equity fund that held a significant minority stake in 3 of Evelyn's competitor firms. He was not a friend. He was the kind of person you invite because not inviting him creates more problems than his presence does. He arrived late, moved through the reception with the comfort of someone who believed every room was fundamentally his, and was on his way to the bar when he passed through the entrance hall where Daniel was standing near the coat check. Victor Ashworth stopped walking. He went very still. The color in his face changed in a way that had nothing to do with the cold air that had come in with the guests. He stared at Daniel for 3 full seconds. Daniel looked back at him with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely unreadable. Victor Ashworth turned and walked to the bar and drank 2 things quickly, and for the rest of the evening he laughed too loudly and stood with his back to the entrance hall. Evelyn watched all of this from across the room. She stored it the way she stored everything that didn't yet make sense. She found the article by accident. She had been searching for a logistics technology acquisition from 4 years prior that her late husband had been involved in, and the search results returned a cascade of related stories, and among them on the second page was a headline from a financial news archive: "Tech billionaire Daniel Brooks presumed dead after financial collapse." The photograph beside it showed a younger man at a podium, confident and precise, in a dark suit, speaking to a room of people who were watching him with the focused attention reserved for people who control things. Evelyn looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at the date of the article. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, and then she opened it again and read everything. She confronted him the next morning in the kitchen before the house was properly awake. She set her phone on the table with the article facing up. Daniel looked at it. He sat down, which was the first time he had ever sat in her kitchen without being invited to, and Evelyn thought that was the most honest thing he had done yet. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not hesitation but preparation. Then he told her. His company had been called Brooks Meridian Technologies. He and his co-founder, a man named Patrick Hartwell, had built a logistics software platform that at its peak was processing freight data for 1 in every 5 commercial shipments in North America. It had been genuinely new, genuinely his. He had started it in a 2-room office in Chicago with 7 people who believed in the idea enough to take below-market salaries. By the 3rd year, they had over 400 employees. By the 5th year, they were fielding acquisition offers from 3 of the largest technology conglomerates in the country, all of which Daniel had declined because he believed they were building something that should not be owned by a committee. That decision had frustrated Patrick Hartwell, who had always wanted the exit, and frustrated people Daniel now understood find other ways to take what they want. 5 years ago, Patrick Hartwell had begun siphoning funds through a network of subsidiaries and had arranged for those transactions to be traced back to Daniel's accounts. By the time Daniel understood what was happening, the forensic accountants had already given their preliminary findings to the SEC, and the findings said Daniel Brooks. The board removed him. The investors sued. The press coverage was immediate and total. His wife Claire lasted 4 months into the investigation before she told him she needed to protect herself and their daughter from the fallout. She took Lily to her parents in Scottsdale. Then a judge, looking at a case that had no clear resolution in sight, arranged a separate custody agreement that brought Lily back to Daniel, a ruling Claire had not contested. Perhaps because some part of her knew that whatever Daniel's failures had been, Lily needed him. But by then, there was no house, no account, no name that didn't trigger a reaction in people who had read the headlines. He had spent a year fighting it legally with diminishing resources and a lawyer who eventually stopped returning calls. He had spent another year simply surviving, and then he had stopped telling people his name. "You thought about not surviving," Evelyn said. It was not a question. He looked at the table. There was a night, he said. I was in a motel outside Cincinnati. Lily was asleep, and I sat by the window for a long time. He stopped. But she woke up, he said. She came and climbed into my lap and said she'd had a dream that we were living somewhere really nice and there was a dog, and she asked if we could get a dog. A brief pause. I told her yes. His voice was very even when he said it, but his hands on the table were not. Evelyn looked at his hands. She thought about Richard. She thought about the night she'd been called to the hospital, and the doctor had walked toward her down the hallway with an expression that had told her everything before he'd said a word, and how she'd sat down on the floor of that hallway because her legs had made a decision her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She told Daniel about that night in the same plain, even way he had spoken to her. They sat in the kitchen as the house began to wake around them, and they talked the way people talk when they have both been to the same dark country and come back a little altered. Something shifted after that morning. Not suddenly. In the way that trust shifts gradually, and then all at once, so that you look back and cannot identify the precise moment. Lily began to follow Evelyn to the greenhouse in the afternoons, where Evelyn kept the orchid collection that had been her one private indulgence since Richard's death. She taught Lily how to check the moisture in the soil, which Lily took very seriously. Daniel, driving Evelyn to a board meeting on a Friday morning, said without preamble that the financial report her CFO had presented at the last review had a discrepancy in the operating lease adjustments that was being used to obscure a cash flow problem, and that she should ask specifically about the Q3 subsidiary reconciliations before she signed anything. Evelyn had her CFO called into a separate meeting that afternoon. The discrepancy was confirmed. It was not malicious, a modeling error rather than fraud, but it would have caused a significant problem in the next audit cycle. She thanked Daniel in the car on the way home. He nodded once and kept his eyes on the road. But there were things he was not telling her. She could feel them the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. He watched certain cars on the street. He'd excused himself twice from the garage to make calls that he ended quickly when she appeared. And then she noticed the black SUV. It had appeared 3 times in 4 days in different locations, once outside her office building, once on the block behind the house, once in the parking structure of the Whitmore Club. Different plates each time, but the same model and the same particular way it sat engine running, no one getting in or out. She mentioned it to Daniel. He was quiet for 2 beats too long before he said it was probably nothing. She knew it wasn't nothing. And 2 days later, he got a message on a phone she hadn't known he had. She only saw it for a second over his shoulder as he turned away. 3 words on the screen. You were supposed to stay buried. The attack on Carter Logistics came on a Monday, which was when the markets had the least mercy. By 11 in the morning, the company's stock had dropped 9% on the back of a story planted in a financial newsletter that suggested irregularities in the company's federal freight contracts. By noon, 2 board members had called Evelyn requesting emergency sessions. By 2 in the afternoon, a reporter had somehow obtained an internal memo real, but taken drastically out of context, that suggested the company had known about a safety complaint and delayed action. The memo was from 4 years ago. It had been reviewed, resolved, and closed. The safety officer involved had filed a secondary report confirming the resolution. None of that context appeared in the story. The story used words like concealed and liability exposure, and attributed its source only to a person with knowledge of internal company practices. Evelyn sat in her office while Margaret fielded calls and her phone lit continuously, and she recognized what was happening with a clarity that came from watching Richard deal with similar orchestrated pressure during the early expansion years. This was not journalism. This was a weapon. And it had been assembled by someone who understood specifically which levers to pull on a company like hers. The federal contract angle, the safety implication, the board anxiety. Someone who knew the industry from the inside. Daniel appeared at her office door at 3:45. He had a yellow legal pad with notes and a look she had not seen on him before, focused in a way that was very still, the way certain animals go still before they move fast. He said, "Tell me everything you know about Patrick Hartwell." She had not mentioned that name to him. He had found it himself. Working backward from the consulting group named in the newsletter story to an advisory relationship it had maintained with a board subcommittee at Carter Logistics, a relationship that predated Richard's death by 2 years. He had made that connection in less than a day. She understood then fully for the first time who she was actually dealing with. What he told her that evening across the dining table with Lily asleep upstairs and the house finally quiet was methodical and devastating. Patrick Hartwell had not acted alone. The network of subsidiaries that had been used to frame Daniel had required cooperation from 3 other entities: a private fund, a law firm, and a consulting group that specialized in what it described on its own materials as stakeholder management, which was a phrase that could mean many things, and in this case meant the management of people who were becoming problems. The consulting group had deep ties to the board of Carter Logistics through advisory contracts that predated Richard's death by 2 years. What Daniel had recently confirmed through a contact he trusted and would not name was that Richard Carter had been one of the peripheral parties involved in the original deal, not the architect, not the primary beneficiary. He had been approached through the consulting relationship and had agreed to a passive role that he may not have fully understood at the time, one of those situations where someone signs a document because they trust the person handing them the pen and does not ask enough questions. But then he had started asking questions, and the answers had changed what he understood himself to have agreed to. And Richard Carter, who had built a company from one freight depot, and who had opinions about everything from wine to infrastructure policy, had decided he could not stay quiet. He had started preparing documentation. He had reached out to someone at the federal level. He had told someone he trusted the wrong someone that he intended to make it right. Evelyn did not speak for a long time after Daniel finished. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She thought about the photograph on her bedside table, Richard laughing at a sailboat race in Newport sun on his face, completely happy. She thought about the police detective who had told her the highway conditions that night had been very bad and accidents happened, and she thought about how she had accepted that because grief takes the path of least resistance, and the alternative was something she had not yet been ready to hold. She said very quietly, "He was going to do the right thing." Daniel said, "Yes, I believe he was." She said, "And they killed him for it." He didn't answer, which was its answer. She excused herself and went to the bathroom and sat on the floor of it for a while, the way she had sat on the floor of the hospital hallway 3 years ago, and let herself know what she now knew. The knowing was terrible, but it was also in some way she could not yet articulate a strange and painful relief because her husband had been trying to fix it. He had not been the villain. He had been the man who saw the wrong thing and moved toward the harder right one. That was the man in the sailboat photograph. That was the man she had known. She stood up and washed her face and came back to the table. "Tell me what we do," she said. They did not have time to do much before the escalation. Lily did not come home from school on Wednesday. The school called at 3:27 to say she had been picked up by a man who had shown the front office a note handwritten and signed with Daniel's name. Daniel was in the car with Evelyn when the call came through. What happened to his face in that moment was something Evelyn would think about for a long time afterward. Not panic, but something more fundamental, a cold and complete restructuring of priorities. He was out of the car before it had fully stopped. Lily was found 40 minutes later, 2 blocks from the school, sitting on a bench, eating a granola bar held by a woman who had found her crying. Lily had been in a car for 20 minutes, spoken to by 2 men she didn't know, and then led out and told to sit there. She was physically unhurt. She was very quiet for the rest of the day, even quieter than usual. That evening, she climbed into Daniel's lap the way she apparently had in the Cincinnati motel, and he wrapped his arms around her and didn't move for a long time. Evelyn sat across the room and did not look away. She was not frightened anymore. Frightened had passed somewhere in those 40 minutes of not knowing. What she felt now was something colder and more useful. What happened to Daniel after that? The transformation, if you could call it that, though it was less a change than a return, was not loud. He did not raise his voice. He did not make speeches. He made calls at all hours to people who clearly knew his real name and spoke to him in the shorthand of people who had worked with him before. He spread documents across the study that Evelyn had cleared for him, printouts, photographs, financial records he had apparently been accumulating for years in digital form, waiting for the moment he had enough cover to use them. He connected a second monitor to a laptop, worked through 2 consecutive nights without sleeping, and by Thursday morning he had a package that he sent simultaneously to 3 federal addresses and a journalist at a national paper who he said was trustworthy and had been looking for this story for 2 years. He told Evelyn what he was doing at each step, not asking permission, but including her as a matter of respect. She appreciated that. She was coming to understand a man who operated from respect as a baseline rather than a performance. He was also a man who felt responsible for the danger he had brought to her door. He said so directly, which she had come to recognize as his way, no circumlocution, no managed framing. He said he was sorry. She told him that the people who had killed her husband had been in her house long before he arrived, that the danger had always been here just below the surface, and that she was grateful someone was finally helping her see it clearly. He looked at her for a moment in that way he had fully without deflection, and then he looked away, and neither of them said anything. But something settled between them that was quiet and solid and did not need naming yet. The night of the confessions, as Evelyn later thought of it, happened on a Friday. Lily was asleep, worn out from a week of school and the particular exhaustion of children who have been holding themselves together through something they don't fully understand, but can feel in the texture of the adults around them. The house was warm and held the particular stillness of late evening in winter, when the cold outside makes indoor light feel deliberate, like a choice rather than a default, like something you have to decide to create rather than something that simply arrives. They were in the sitting room, Evelyn with a glass of wine she wasn't really drinking. Daniel with coffee he'd made himself, because he'd learned where everything was without being shown in the way of people who pay attention by instinct. They were not talking about Patrick Hartwell or the board of directors or federal investigations. They were talking about other things. The way certain losses change your relationship with time, how the years before the bad thing and the years after it belong to different people who share the same name. The specific quality of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who need things from you, while no one thinks to ask what you need, which is a loneliness more complete than ordinary isolation because it has company. The particular courage required to let someone in after you have seen what losing them can do to a person, after you have sat with that knowledge for enough years that you start to mistake the caution for wisdom. Evelyn said she had not been afraid of being alone. She had been afraid of wanting not to be. Because wanting felt like weakness, and weakness felt in her world like the beginning of the end. She had watched her father manage grief by simply not allowing it, by insisting that forward motion was its own answer, and she had inherited that approach without meaning to the way you inherit the furniture of the house you grow up in. Daniel said he understood that completely. He said that after the company collapsed and Claire left, he had decided the safest thing was to want as little as possible. Food, shelter, Lily's safety. The next day, nothing beyond that. He said it had worked in the way that amputations work. You stop losing blood, but you're also missing a limb, and the missing limb aches in ways that don't follow any predictable schedule and that you cannot explain to people who have not experienced it. Evelyn laughed at that briefly and genuinely, in the way you laugh at things that are true and painful and somehow also exact. He watched her laugh. He said quietly, "You have a good laugh. You don't use it enough." She said she was aware. There was a pause that was comfortable rather than awkward, the kind that only happens between people who have reached a certain threshold of honesty with each other and found on the other side of it that they are still in the same room. From upstairs, as if on cue, came the soft sound of Lily padding to the bathroom and back to bed. They both looked at the ceiling automatically, both of them tracking the small familiar sound, and both of them smiling without deciding to. Daniel said, "She asked me yesterday if you were going to be here for Christmas." Evelyn set her wine glass down carefully on the side table. "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her I hoped so." Evelyn looked at him. He looked back. She said, "I'll be here." And that was all. But it was enough. Some things are complete in themselves, and that was one of them. He was gone by morning. Not willingly. Evelyn woke to find his coffee cup on the kitchen counter still faintly warm and the door to the garage standing open. His phone, the secondary one she hadn't known about, was on the floor of the garage between two cars, as if it had been dropped in a hurry or knocked loose. Margaret was the one who found the fuel cap from Daniel's car in the driveway beside a set of fresh tire marks that were not Evelyn's car and were not the household delivery vehicle. She was the one who said very calmly the words Evelyn had already assembled but not yet spoken, "I think someone took him." I think Evelyn Carter did not collapse. She had already used up her floor sitting in the bathroom the previous week and could not afford it now. She called a man named Thomas Reed, a former federal prosecutor she had known through Richard, who had offered her his card 3 years ago and said to call him if she ever needed someone to believe her first and ask questions second. She called him at 6:47 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring. She said, in order and without excess, who Daniel was, what he had found, what he had sent to the federal addresses, and what she believed had happened in the night. Thomas Reed asked 4 precise questions and then said he would make calls. He called back in 11 minutes and said that there were people already aware of the Hartwell network and that what Daniel had sent the previous day had moved a passive investigation into an active one. The question was location. They had 2 hours before whoever had taken him would determine that the evidence package had already been delivered and that Daniel was no longer useful to keep. Evelyn did not wait for Thomas Reed's people to find him. She used the resources she had. Carter Logistics operated a freight management center that ran 24-hour surveillance across 17 commercial districts in the metro area. As part of a government contract, cameras mounted on utility poles in loading docks and parking structures positioned to monitor cargo movement. She called the operations center directly and gave her authorization code and told them what she was looking for, a dark SUV. The model she had memorized across 3 different sightings, moving between 11 in the evening and 2 in the morning, heading away from Ridgemont Hill. The operations manager was a woman named Denise, who had worked the night shift for 9 years and who did not waste time on questions that could wait. It took her 40 minutes. The vehicle had moved east off the commercial corridors, into the old warehouse district along the river where the city's manufacturing past sat empty and unsupervised, the kind of area that appears on no tourist map and that civic planners have been meaning to redevelop for 30 years without anything ever happening. Cold storage facilities mostly, loading bays, buildings with addresses that still registered in city records but had not had active utilities for a decade. Evelyn got into her car, her own car, not waiting for anyone, and drove east with Thomas Reed's mobile number on speaker and Lily in the care of Margaret, who had held the girl's hand all morning and told her that her father was very good at getting through difficult things, which was entirely true, and which Lily appeared to find genuinely reassuring. Daniel was in a building that had been a cold storage facility once long enough ago that the insulation had failed, and the inside was not much warmer than the outside. He had been placed in a chair that was not tied with rope. They had been more careful than that, using zip ties at his wrists, and had been speaking to 2 men for some hours. The men were professionals in the way that certain people are professional, calm, methodical, entirely without the dramatic affect of movie villains, which made them more frightening rather than less. They wanted to know what he had already shared, and with whom and in what form, and whether any of it was recoverable. He gave them nothing, not because he was performing heroism, because he was thinking about Lily, who was with Evelyn, who would not let anything happen to her, and about the sitting room 2 nights before, and about the sound of Evelyn's laugh in the quiet house, and because those things made it very simple to determine what mattered and what did not. He had survived Cincinnati. He had survived 2 years of having nothing. He had sat by a motel window in the dark and chosen to stay, and that choice had led him through roads that made no logical sense to a house on Ridgemont Hill and a 7-year-old's complete confidence in him, and a woman who drove her own car into a warehouse district at dawn. He would survive this. The men in the room with him were operating on the assumption that he had nothing left to protect. That was the miscalculation. He had everything. When the door opened and the cold storage facility filled with voices that were not his 2 companions, and then with light from the entrance, and then with the specific organized sound of federal agents moving through a building with a floor plan they had been briefed on, Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and looked at the door. Evelyn was standing in the opening, still in her good coat, entirely composed in the way of someone who's been running on adrenaline and will not permit it to show until later. Her eyes found him immediately and stayed. She walked across the concrete floor without hurrying, and she crouched in front of his chair and she said, "Sorry I took so long." He said, "You were fast enough." She said, "Are you hurt?" He considered this honestly. "Somewhat," he said. "Not badly." She nodded once, looked at his hands, and turned to the nearest agent to ask about the zip ties. Patrick Hartwell was arrested at the private airport west of the city at 8:42 in the morning, 40 minutes after the cold storage facility was cleared. He had been standing at the base of a helicopter on the tarmac in a coat that cost more than most people's cars, and he had by all accounts looked genuinely disbelieving when the vehicles pulled across the tarmac, as though the laws that applied to everyone else had finally gotten around to him by mistake. 2 other members of the network were picked up that same day. The third, a lawyer named Creighton Walsh, who had been the primary architect of the documentation used to frame Daniel, turned himself in through counsel the following morning after the federal case was formally announced in a press release that contained in careful legal language the bones of everything Daniel had assembled across 2 years of survival and 6 days of working from Evelyn's study. The full exoneration took 8 months. These things always take longer than the crime. The SEC issued a formal clearance. 3 financial outlets published corrections and apologies of varying sincerity, 2 of them on their front pages, and 1 in a small item on page 14 that Evelyn noted and filed and said nothing about publicly. A judge expunged the civil fraud findings from the record. The law firm that had handled Daniel's original defense, the one with the lawyer who stopped returning calls, sent a letter that Daniel read once and then placed in a drawer and never looked at again. The asset recovery was partial. Some things that had been sold or transferred could not be unwound, and the law of diminishing returns applies to legal remedies as much as it applies to anything else but sufficient. He was by any reasonable measure a wealthy man again. He did not feel like a wealthy man. He felt like a man who had been given back time, which is a different and more bewildering thing. Time is harder to hold than money. It has no clear value until you have spent too long without it. He did not return to technology. He did not want a board seat or an investment portfolio or a company name on a building in a city center. He had spent enough years being defined by those things to know that they had never been the point. What he built instead was small and deliberate a nonprofit placement organization that connected people experiencing homelessness with stable employment, working primarily with the freight and logistics sector, because that was the industry he understood from every angle, from the boardroom down to the fuel depot, and because the industry, whatever its considerable flaws, had jobs that paid livable wages, offered advancement based on performance rather than connection, and had a chronic shortage of reliable workers that made employers genuinely motivated to retain the people they hired. The organization was called Second Corridor, which was a logistics term for an alternate routing path, a way through when the primary route is blocked. An assumption built into every serious freight operation that the first path will sometimes fail and you need to have already identified the next one. Evelyn joined the board in the second month. She brought 2 of her operating managers in to consult on the employment pipeline, and she quietly ensured that 3 of Carter Logistics regional depots became early placement partners. She did not make a public announcement about her involvement. She did not need to. The work was the announcement. She also sold 17% of her Carter Logistics shares, reducing her controlling stake to a level that still gave her authority, but freed her from the specific weight of total ownership. She promoted her CFO, the one who had made the modeling error, who had been mortified and had corrected it, and had been twice as careful since to co-CEO. She kept an office. She came in 3 days a week. She found to her moderate surprise that she liked the company more when she was not carrying all of it. Richard's involvement in the Hartwell network was disclosed carefully to the federal investigators as part of the broader case. The investigators concluded, as Daniel had believed, that Richard Carter had been preparing to cooperate with authorities at the time of his death, and that his death had not been accidental. A separate criminal investigation was opened. Evelyn gave everything she had to it. She did not find peace in that process exactly, but she found something else, the particular hard comfort of knowing what actually happened, which is different from peace but in some ways more sustaining because it does not require forgetting. By the following spring, Ridgemont Hill sounded different. There was a dog, a calm and enormous golden retriever that Lily had named Captain, who took up more than his fair share of any couch he occupied, and regarded guests with the benign authority of someone who has decided that hospitality is his particular calling. There was breakfast most mornings at the long dining table that had been set for 3 years. The table now populated by a 7-year-old with strong opinions about which kind of cereal was acceptable, and a man who made coffee the same way every morning, 2 scoops water, just off the boil 3 minutes, and handed a cup to Evelyn before she asked for it, because he paid attention, and because paying attention was how he showed things he did not yet always say. The greenhouse was visited regularly. The orchids were thriving. Margaret had stopped giving Evelyn worried looks, which was either because she had relaxed or because she had transferred her worry to more productive channels. Either way, the house had an easier quality. There were still days that were hard. There are always days that are hard. Grief does not evaporate. It subsides, it becomes part of the landscape, rather than the whole of it. But they were hard in the normal way, the human way, the way that doesn't require sitting on floors or performing fineness for people who need you to be okay. Evelyn had stopped performing that quietly without announcement. She had simply stopped. Lily's school held its spring assembly in May. Parents filled the gymnasium in folding chairs that scraped against the polished floor, and the 3rd-grade class performed a short program that involved recitations and 2 songs, and at the end, a segment where individual students were asked to stand and say something they were proud of. Some children said they were proud of learning to ride a bike. Some said they were proud of a grade on a test. A boy near the back said he was proud of his hamster, which got a laugh that he accepted with great seriousness. Lily stood when her name was called. She was wearing a yellow dress, and her hair was in 2 braids that Evelyn had done that morning, slightly imperfect and entirely adequate, which was how Lily had declared them when she looked in the mirror, and which she had meant as a genuine assessment rather than a complaint. She looked out at the audience with her father's steadiness and her own particular quality of calm, the kind that comes not from having been sheltered from hard things, but from having stood beside someone who faced them without running. She said, "My dad once lost everything, his company and his house and almost everything, but he never lost his heart, and that's why I still have him." She sat back down. The gymnasium was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said correctly, when the right words have found the right shape, and there is simply nothing to add to them. Daniel's hand beside Evelyn's on the armrest of their folding chairs turned so that his palm was facing up. She put her hand in his. Neither of them looked at each other. Both of them looked at the small girl in the yellow dress who was now whispering something to the boy beside her, already moving on to the next thing the way children do, because children understand instinctively that the present moment is what you are here for, and that the past, however large, is something you carry rather than something you live inside. The city had called him homeless. The papers had called him a fraudster. The people who had wanted him gone had called him buried. The people who actually knew him, Lily with her absolute and uncomplicated faith, Evelyn with her hard-won and precise and real understanding, called him something else. They called him simply someone who stayed, someone who chose on a night in Cincinnati and again every day after to keep going. Not because it was easy, or because the future was clear, or because he was certain of anything at all, but because a small girl had dreamed about a dog, and because somewhere in a too large mansion on a hill, a woman had been sitting alone at a table set for one, and because the world, for all its specific and targeted cruelties, occasionally routes you somewhere you didn't expect to arrive. The city once called him a homeless man, but the people who truly knew him called him something else, a father who never gave up.